The day Eleanor Vance decided to call the state troopers on me for, illegal trespassing, on what she claimed was her private association water was the exact day she unknowingly handed me the keys to her front door. And man, looking back at that morning now, it's almost funny how a person can be so loud while standing on a foundation made of absolute sand. I was out there at 5 in the morning, just me and the mist rising off the glassy surface of Blackwood Lake, casting my line into the same lily pad shadows I've been hitting since the late 90s, when this shrill, piercing voice shattered the silence like a brick through a window. And there she was, standing on her wraparound mahogany deck in a silk robe that probably cost more than my first truck, screaming about, unauthorized access, and HOA violations, I've lived in this valley for 25 years. Moved here after my wife passed because the city just felt too crowded for a heart that was trying to heal, and this 2-acre slice of heaven was the only place where the world felt quiet again. But Eleanor, who'd moved in 6 months prior from some high-rise in Chicago, decided the lake was and oppose. A gift to be shared, but a commodity to be controlled. When the trooper pulled up, a young guy named Miller, whose dad I actually used to hunt with, he looked like he wanted to be anywhere else on the planet, just shifting his weight and looking at his boots while he told me, "Look, Silas, she filed a formal complaint. She's claiming the new homeowners association owns the water rights. And I got to ask you to pack it up for today, just to keep the peace," And as I looked up at Eleanor, standing there with that smug, self-righteous smirk of a woman who thought she'd just won a war, I felt the snap of my tackle box closing echo across the water like a gavel, and I realized she didn't oppose. She just wanted me gone. She wanted to own the very air we were breathing. What Eleanor didn't oppose, know. What she had oppose, bothered to check in a rush to play Queen of the Suburbs, was that I wasn't oppose. Just some old man with a fishing pole. I was the guy who owned the dirt beneath her feet, the water in her view, and the very legal ground she was trying to stand on. You see, Blackwood Lake ISN and oppose. Like those big public reservoirs where the state manages everything. It's a spring-fed basin surrounded by about 30 properties, most of them old cabins like mine that have been passed down through families who remember when the road was still dirt. But around 2018, the developers found us, and suddenly these massive stone and glass fortresses started popping up, bringing in people who didn't oppose. Want neighbors, they wanted, curb appeal, and exclusivity, Eleanor Vance was the ringleader of that crowd, a former corporate restructuring expert who treated our quiet community like a failing mid-cap company that needed an aggressive makeover. And within 90 days of moving in, she'd bullied 10 of the newer homeowners into forming the, Blackwood Elite Estates Association, And then they started sending out these glossy, threatening newsletters about, standardizing the aesthetic, and, managing communal assets, The real trouble started when she sent out the mandatory enrollment letters, claiming that under some obscure, community improvement, clause, every house on the lake was now part of her HOA and owed $300 a month for, lake maintenance and security, But I just tossed mine in the trash along with the pizza coupons because my deed says I don't oppose. Owe anyone anything but the tax man. And that's when the War of the Roses turned into a full-scale trench battle. She started small, sending her, compliance committee, which was really just 2 guys named Todd and Brent who wore matching polo shirts, to tell me my woodpile was an eyesore and that my 1974 Boston Whaler was, non-compliant, with the new neighborhood maritime standards, and I'd just sit on my porch, sipping a cold beer and waving at them until they got frustrated and retreated back to their manicured lawns. But Eleanor wasn't oppose. The type to take a hint. She was the type to double down. So she hired a private landscaping crew to install a 6-foot wrought iron fence right across the old trailhead that the local kids and the elderly folks like Mrs. Gable used to get down to the water, claiming it was a, liability mitigation measure, And when I saw Mrs. Gable standing there with her little grandson, looking at that fence with tears in her eyes because she couldn't oppose, take her morning, walk by the water anymore, that's when the fire in my gut turned into a cold, hard focus. I spent the next 3 days in the basement of the county records office, a place that smells like old dust and damp paper, talking to a clerk named Martha, who's been there so long, she probably remembers when the ink was still wet on the original land grants. And we started digging through the archives of the old Miller Creek Logging Company that folded back in the 50s. As Martha pulled these brittle, yellowed maps out of the deep storage, her eyes went wide behind her bifocals, and she whispered in quote, "Silas, you might want to sit down for this, because if this survey is correct, the end oppos. Blackwood Elite and oppos. I ascend and oppos. T just overstepping. They're literally building on air," end quote. And she pointed to a deed from 1954 that my father had bought for a song when the logging company went bankrupt, a deed that didn't end oppos. T just covered my 2-acre lot, but included the entire subsurface rights and the end quote. Exclusive riparian basin end quote of the lake itself. In this part of the country, water rights are a tangled web of old world law. And because this lake was technically an artificial basin created by a private dam built by the loggers, the ownership of the lake bed meant ownership of the water and oppos. use, and since that dam and the land beneath the water were part of my family and oppos. Estate, the end quote, communal asset end quote. Eleanor was trying to charge people for actually belonged to me, lock, stock, and barrel. I kept that information tucked away like a winning poker hand, watching Eleanor escalate her campaign, watching her organize and quote, enforcement meetings and quote, at her house where she'd serve expensive wine and talk about and quote, cleaning up the riffraff and quote, and she even went as far as to file a lien against my property for and quote, unpaid HOA dues and quote, which is a bold move for someone who doesn't end oppos. T realized they're trying to sue the person who owns their view. The climax of her arrogance came when she announced the end quote, Blackwood Beautification Gala, end quote, a fancy event where she invited the local press and the county commissioners to show off her, end quote, successful revitalization, end quote, of the lakefront, and she specifically sent me a, end quote, notice of exclusion, end quote, telling me that if I was seen on the water during the event, I'd be arrested for aggravated trespassing. The night of the gala, the lake was lit up with these floating lanterns, and the sound of string quartet was drifting over the water, making the whole place feel like a movie set for people who have more money than sense. And Eleanor was standing at a podium on her lawn, talking into a microphone about how she'd, end quote, restored order and value, end quote, to Blackwood Lake. I waited until she reached the part of her speech where she thanked the community for, end quote, uniting under a shared vision of excellence, end quote, and then I rowed my old, beat-up wooden boat right into the center of the lanterns, the oars creaking loudly in the quiet night, and I didn't end oppos. T stopped until I was 20 feet from her dock, where the county commissioners were sitting with their mouths open. Eleanor turned bright red, her face contorting in that ugly way people's faces do when their ego is bruised, and she shrieked, end quote, Trooper, get him out of here. I told you he was a menace. I want him in handcuffs right now, end quote. And that's when I stood up in the boat, pulled a laminated stack of papers out of my jacket, and said, end quote, I'd be happy to leave, Eleanor, but seeing as I'm currently standing on my own property, you might find that a bit difficult to enforce, end quote. The silence that followed was so heavy you could have carved it with a knife. And as I tossed a copy of a 1954 deed and the certified survey on her dock, I watched the color drain out of her face until she looked like a ghost in a silk dress. And I calmly explained to the county commissioners that not only was the HOA invalid, but that Eleanor's fence, her dock, and even the floating lanterns were currently trespassing on my private land. My lawyer, a sharp-as-a-tack woman named Sarah who specializes in land disputes, stepped out from the crowd of, end quote, unauthorized, end quote, neighbors I'd invited to watch the show, and she handed Eleanor a formal cease and desist order, along with an invoice for 6 months of back rent for the, end quote, unauthorized use of the riparian basin, end quote, and a demand for the immediate removal of the wrought iron fence. It turned out that because the HOA had been collecting money under the false pretense of owning the lake, they were now on the hook for fraud, and the, end quote, elite estates, end quote, members who had been bullied into paying Eleanor were suddenly realizing that their, end quote, queen, end quote, had led them right into a legal meat grinder. The aftermath was a beautiful kind of chaos. The HOA dissolved within a week as the Todds and Brents of the world scrambled to distance themselves from Eleanor's crumbling empire, and the county commissioners, embarrassed by the public display of incompetence, fast-tracked the removal of the gate that had blocked the old trailhead. I didn't end oppos, sue my neighbors, because most of them were just scared of losing their property values. But I did make sure Eleanor paid every cent of the legal fees it took to set things right, and the look on her face when she had to watch the county crew tear down her exclusive fence was a moment of pure, unadulterated justice that I'll carry to my grave. She ended up listing her house 4 months later, moving back to the city where she could find some other group of people to manage. But the house sat on the market for a long time because word got out that the view didn't end oppos, come with any rights, and the new family that eventually moved in are good people. They bring me over a plate of ribs when they're grilling, and their kids are out there every morning, learning how to cast a line into the lily pads just like I did when I was their age. Blackwood Lake is quiet again, the way it was meant to be, and every time I see Mrs. Gable walking along the water on the trail that's no longer blocked, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for, even if you have to dig through 60 years of dust to find the weapon you need. But it makes me wonder, how many other, Eleanor's, are out there right now trying to fence off the world and charge people for the privilege of looking at it, and how many people just roll over and pay the fee because they're too tired to fight back. I think there's a thin line between, community standards, neighborhood tyranny, and if you don an oppos, keep an eye on that line. Somebody's going to move it when you aren't into oppos. Looking, so I'm curious, have any of you ever had to stand your ground against Karen, who thought she owned the sky? Or did you find out your, homeowners association, was just a playground for people who never grew out of being the class bully? Drop a comment and tell me your story, because I've got a feeling there are a lot more, Silas's, out there than the bullies realize, and sometimes the best way to handle a person who thinks they own the lake is to show them exactly where the property line ends.